Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast, where together we embark on an apocalyptic adventure through the prophets and Revelation. Though it's a daunting task, we encourage you to embrace the challenge and find captivating truths from the mysterious parts of God's Word. Thanks for listening. I'm Miranda Birch, and with me is Doug Fichter, Sean Lehman, and Rod Gerber on the soundboard. We're glad to be back. It's been a little while since you would have heard from us. We'll be covering the next 3 episodes of Ezekiel from chapters 13 to 26. Here, we transition into the focus of God's judgment coming to Israel. Ezekiel gives a few allegories to show how God views the people, along with acting as a lawyer in some of the chapters as well. Sean, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. We begin our reading this week in chapter 13, which is titled, Woe to False Prophets. So guys, who are these false prophets that Ezekiel's talking about here?
Well, Sean, most likely these were not really prophets at all. Chapter 13, verse 2 says of these people, that prophesy out of their own hearts. It seems they were presenting a message to the people that they were claiming was from God, but the message was really just the desire of their own hearts and the hearts of the people.
That's right. In verse 10, it says that these false prophets are prophesying peace when there is no peace.
So, saying things that they all want to hear, claiming credentials, in this case, divine message from God, where there is none. This sounds like politicians vying for power and influence, if you ask me.
I think that there may have been a lot of that going on. In verse 4, these people are compared to foxes. In one commentary, it said this comparison to foxes suggests that this group of people were not innocently or ignorantly giving these false prophecies, but were knowingly speaking lies and claiming the authority of God, without being given any such authority.
Yeah, lies and self-boasting. Sounds like some leaders even to this day. Will mankind ever learn?
But people still fall victim to their words. It reminds me of the verses in 2 Timothy where Paul talks about how people will not endure sound teaching. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear.
So these false prophets and prophetesses, say that 10 times fast, were prophesying that Israel, specifically the remnant of Israel that remains in Jerusalem, would break free of their Babylonian overrule and regain independence.
Yep.
There's even talk in verses 10 through 16 of a wall being built, but it's not a real wall per se, but a very weak wall that is overlaid with untempered mortar to give the illusion of a strong wall, when in fact it was merely a prop to win favor among the people. And so, as you would expect, God is much displeased with these false prophets, and through Ezekiel is prophesying woe on them.
Yeah, that's right. God says in verses 8 and 9, Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because of your false words and your lying visions, I am against you, declares the sovereign Lord. My hand will be against the prophets who see false visions and utter lying divinations. They will not belong to the council of my people or be listed in the records of Israel, nor will they enter the land of Israel, and then you will know that I am the Lord.
Let's hone in a bit on chapter 15. It is the shortest chapter in Ezekiel, right next to the longest, chapter 16.
Yeah, I found it interesting to note that in chapter 15, Ezekiel uses the illustration of a vine to depict Israel, and it's also in chapter 15 of St. John that Jesus talks about being the vine.
Although, it's in a very different connotation that Ezekiel and Jesus uses the word. In Ezekiel, he uses the likeness of the vine in a negative sense, whereas in John, Jesus uses it in a positive light.
That's true, but it's a really interesting correlation. So like we mentioned earlier, Ezekiel uses quite a few allegories in these couple chapters that he likens Israel to. And as Doug mentioned, chapter 15 is about a vine. For some background information, as we know, Israel has been rebelling to no end against God. Their idolatry and sins run rampant, even as far as worshiping other gods inside the temple. So God and his holiness must purge Jerusalem. So here, Israel is likened unto a worthless vine that must be burned. Doug, let me pose this question. What can a good vine be used for? Can it be used for building material?
No, vines are crooked.
Can it be used for lasting fuel?
No, they burn too quickly to be of any value.
Yeah. And they're too sappy and brittle to be used as pegs to hang something on, as Ezekiel states.
So I guess to answer your first question, the only thing a vine is useful for is to bear fruit.
Yeah, exactly. So Ezekiel compares a vine to a tree as well. A tree can be used for multiple things, but a vine has one job: to produce fruit.
I see where you're going with this. Since Israel was given into sin and is unrepentant, it is no longer producing fruit and is good for nothing else and must be burned. Like the vine, they had one job but ruined it.
Yes. In verses 4 and 5, Ezekiel uses the illustration of the vine branch being charred on both ends. Verse 5 sums it up very well. If the vine branch was worthless when it was whole, how much more worthless is it when it is charred?
Yeah, at this point, Israel was kind of a lost cause. They needed to be fully exiled from their home and purged. As the Lord states in verse 8, He will make their land desolate or destroyed because they have been an unfaithful nation.
Can you imagine? Just picture all of us in the state of Indiana being kicked out and enslaved to Illinois for 70 years.
It's sad that they let themselves get to that point, but we can relate to them more than what we think we do. Thankfully, we have Jesus to mediate for us rather than having to go through what the nation of Israel did.
We have talked about Ezekiel comparing the Israelites to a worthless vine in chapter 15, and now they're compared to the faithless bride in chapter 16.
Well, that doesn't sound very uplifting.
Nope. It seems Ezekiel was very concerned about the holiness of God and consequently the sin of his people. Some of the people are now captives in Babylon, and Ezekiel comes across very strongly in denouncing their sin and reminding them of how they ended up as captives.
Well, I suppose if we would have had a vision of God on his throne being wheeled around the sky like Ezekiel did, it would certainly deepen our view of God's holiness, and we would also take more offense at the sins against him.
Yeah, I agree. Doug, backing up a bit, you said some of the people were in captivity. Do you want to elaborate on that a little?
Well, if I followed the timeline correctly, the first captives were taken in 605 BC. Ezekiel was taken captive in 597 BC when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, but the final destruction of Jerusalem did not take place until 586 BC.
Okay, so it's interesting. In verse 1 of chapter 16, God told Ezekiel to speak to the city of Jerusalem.
Yeah, Jerusalem was still standing, like we said, and most likely the exiles in Babylon still had hope that everything was going to get back in order and they would return to their homeland soon.
But Ezekiel knew that Jerusalem was doomed, and the message that God gave him to speak had to be very unsettling to the people.
Yeah, the comparisons to the unfaithful bride and the shocking language used throughout chapter 16 had to be uncomfortable for everyone, even Ezekiel.
Yet the people needed to hear it. They had forsaken God, turned to idols, committed unspeakable sins, and they needed to be confronted and reminded why they were in captivity.
Yeah, we get a reminder how far they had fallen when starting in verse 44, it says they were even more corrupt than Sodom and Samaria. This had to be very insulting to a proud people who knew they were God's elect, and most likely they thought they were above those cities.
In verse 49, Ezekiel addresses the iniquity of Sodom and doesn't even mention their sexual sins, even though they were well known. He talks about the sin of pride along with the abundance of food and idleness, and also that they did not help the poor and needy. The Israelites had fallen into the same trap, and according to Ezekiel, had fallen even lower than Sodom.
Yeah, Miranda, we could relate to that even today. Pride, abundance of food, idleness on some people's part. Yeah. But yet there's reason and a purpose for pointing this out.
For sure, there's hope. Starting in verse 53, the promise of restoration is laid out. God says he will establish an everlasting covenant, and again says that you shall know that I am the Lord, which, by the way, is said more than 50 times in the book of Ezekiel.
Yeah, God is always in the business of bringing souls back to him. To close this out, let's go back and read chapter 14, verse 11.
Yeah, I can do that. That the house of Israel may no more go astray from me, nor defile themselves any more with all their transgressions, but that they may be my people, and I may be their God, declares the Lord. At the risk of oversimplifying, that may just sum up God's desire for all people.
Well, that wraps up our podcast for this week. The Babylonian captivity was a dark time for the people of Israel, and Ezekiel had some hard messages from God. Sin had brought a great separation, but thankfully, this story doesn't end here. Ever since the fall in the Garden of Eden, God has been weaving a story of redemption for his people. We are blessed to be on this side of history for the children of Israel during this time and have it recorded in the Bible. May it strengthen our faith for the work that God is doing in our lives today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.